Okay, so as we move away from India, we're moving into Africa. And Africa is a diverse and large country with dozens of nations, and I have chosen a single writer as the representation of Africa. That's highly problematic for a number of reasons, but it's also the only real novel I put on the syllabus. And I think I've done that because it's one of the most important novels in terms of the way we talk about world literature. Achebe may be one of the most important figures in the way we talk about world literature, specifically because A, he decided to write in English, and B, he really was representing at the sort of beginning of what we think of as world lit studies, his culture and its engagement with the larger world it brought. Now, that's not to say that there isn't plenty of world literature, world music, the sort of world cultural studies that really focuses in on a specific culture. I mean, that's what cultural anthropology is intended to do all the time. This was something bigger, and so when we talk about world literature or world culture, and it's such a misnomer as a concept because you cannot have a world literature. I mean, like, you're always picking and choosing certain texts, right? You're like privileging certain things. I'm privileging Achebe in this particular course for no other reason other than he is sort of the individual who popularized the idea of world literature as a concept, as well as said that a bigger audience, a more engaged audience, a wider spread dispersal of the work itself is valuable. And so Things Fall Apart is that book, really. I mean, 1958 it was written, and it has been read by millions and millions of people. Famously, he won the Man Booker Prize towards the end of his life. It surprises me he's not a Nobel laureate, that he never won the Nobel Prize. There are people who are less deserving, and they have gotten it. But he is an amazing writer, very smart, academic, engaged poet. I mean, he's a lyricist. He actually, the words on the page are valuable to him. And he understood English as well as anybody else, who's a native speaker. He was born in 1930 in what now is Nigeria, and he was a member of the Igbo tribe, IGBO. He decided he would write in English, I think, because of the accessibility and the widespread dispersal of the English language, right? Like, he knew at that point, like, all over Africa, there was a good representation of English being read, but all over the world, right? You can go to South America, Central America, someone there is going to know English. And so it was a pretty smart move on his part in terms of publishing. But I think he also really appreciated or wanted that accessibility. I never met the man, obviously. But that interview that you see him in that I posted, he seems very cognizant of how do you spread your sort of cultural awareness and cultural engagement, and how do you, in fact, talk about individual culture in the larger picture of humanity. But again, I sort of have to qualify all of this, right, with saying that, like, dozens of countries exist in Africa, right? And each of those countries have produced artists who deserve to be celebrated. And so it is very reductive that I chose only a single text to represent from Africa. So that's on me. But when you create a syllabus, you have to consider certain things. And I consider stories that I can engage with, and I think I can teach well. I think I can teach Achebe's story well. So Things Fall Apart, really interesting narrative. I mentioned earlier that he's from the Igbo tribe. The character's also from the Igbo tribe, and it's about that moment when colonialism really does first show up in America and in Nigeria, in Africa. In that first moment when it really does show up. And how does it always show up first? It's usually missionaryism, right? It's usually like the sort of colonization of religious beliefs earliest. There's lots of reasons why, and religion has done lots of good things for lots of people. And actually, if we think about it today, Africa has one of the largest, South America and Africa are the places where Catholicism is still sort of thriving. In Europe and America, it's not doing as well as it used to do. Just saying, that is the truth. So it's a story about a guy who's sort of tribal, and he does something he might not should have done in terms of the way the gods would view him. But he does it, I think, for some sort of masculine engagement, but also he felt that he had some sort of, like, I'm not going to fail in this moment. I'm not going to, like, look like I'm weaker. Might be a cultural thing, but I think you could, I hope that when we read these texts, you can apply any of the sort of cultural relevancy to humanity as a whole, right? So, like, the idea that there is a certain form of masculinity and the presentation of masculinity in this narrative, you should be able, with comparative literature and comparative literary studies, look at something else and be like, well, maybe masculinity has like a line that connects sort of the threads. All humanity is connected, and so maybe in some ways that as well is connected. So he makes a decision and does something he probably shouldn't do. I don't want to give too much of the story away. And he gets exiled, him and his family. And they're gone for 7 years. And when he comes back to the village that he grew up in, and he was actually once a prominent figure in, now there's a bunch of missionaries. And the conflict now moves to the idea of like a cultural. So it goes from like individual cultures to a larger cultural fight. There is a suicide in the story, and I don't love it when stories end in suicide all the time. Kate Chopin, I'm looking at you. No, Kate Chopin's a fine writer, and I have lots of friends that defend her, and she's lovely. I just hate reading The Awakening. It's not a great story, in my opinion. But no, I think it's important to think about the way that like writing has changed. Right now, I think if someone commits suicide, we often like, it's kind of hacky. It's not the best way to end a story, right? Like, there are better ways a story could end, more creative ways a story could end. So as we read this, as we move into Africa, and I think I very plainly said, Africa dash Achebe. As we move into Achebe's work, I think it's good to think about sort of colonialism as we've talked about in the past, and post-colonialism as the study of colonialism and the way we engage with it, because this is definitely a post-colonial story. That's not to say stories like Afra, Ben's, Orinoco haven't looked retroactively at the past and been like, that is also in some ways a post-colonial story, right? Because it takes place in multiple nations. It talks about the transatlantic slave trade. It like brings it from Africa to South America, or at least the Caribbean specifically. And so those are all post-colonial moves, or post-colonial like modes of criticism, not even modes of criticism, excuse me, post-colonial spots for criticism, spots for analysis, right? Like, those are texts for us to look at so we can, in fact, think about the larger post-colonial project, which I think is to think about the way European culture has, in fact, like affected the world. And not all of it's been negative. I mean, the spread of linguistic engagement, the spread of literature, art. I mean, there's a celebration of all sorts of like Black culture today, whether it be like Afro-Caribbean or Creole or South American culture that's not Black, but has its own indigenous sort of place. I mean, post-colonialism has allowed for a greater celebration or an increase of what the value of art is across the board. That being said, colonialism itself also like exploited and like used the bodies of hundreds of thousands, if not millions and millions of people over the course of hundreds of years, mostly for capital gain. And I mentioned this when I gave the East India lecture tour, right? The East India Company lecture. Yeah. It was all about commerce. I mean, what in this world isn't driven by commerce in some way? And I think actually, as we talk about specifically India this week, and we talk about Salman Rushdie, capitalism will come up, because definitely in Salman Rushdie's story, there was a whole overt thing about capitalism and the sort of captains of industry exploiting their positions to gain more money. And that actually brings me to my second point that I wanted to make during this lecture specifically is I just mentioned that. Postmodernism. Modernism is this weird idea that happened after World War I specifically. We think about the Enlightenment as sort of the awakening of humanity. Before that, all art celebrated either God or nature, right? God and nature are the creators of all things. Whether you believe in God or not, the idea that like those were the ultimate, the absolute, the everything we understood to be, God and nature. The Enlightenment actually, the whole I think therefore I am, the internal idea of perception and the value of perception, the awakening of human thought. It's not that science and technology didn't exist before that, and it wasn't that like they only had like function. People were doing science in ancient Greece just to do science. They were doing math just to do math because it was interesting to them. But something about the Enlightenment, it was this moment that really sort of like, it made us like look introspectively into ourselves and really consider like, what is the value of humanity and like the way we in fact create things. I think there's value in that, and I always have. So the Enlightenment happens in like the 1700s. Late 1800s, you see the expressionist art period, right? Before that, art had really celebrated God and nature, right? Like it was either paintings of things that like made sense, terrible moments or religious moments or the moments of death or the human body and all its greatness, or is nature? And it was like beauty, space, time. Something about expressionism changed that. You look at people like Van Gogh and Monet. They started painting nature, but with real expression. Realism was no longer important. The feeling that nature gave you, that was more valuable. So that was like, the 1700s, the Enlightenment, 1820s forward, the Impressionist period. You start seeing these really crazy paintings and, like big, bold colors, like really caked on paints, just to give some expression of emotion more than the idea of realism. That became less important. Realism became less important. All the way up until World War I. And during World War I think there was such inhumanity seen by the regular person that shifted the way we actually saw the world. It was no longer like man knows the answers. It was like everything can be like the worst. Everything can fail. The term entropy actually comes into play, I think, there specifically. That entropy means the dissolution or the way things fall apart, the rotting of something, right? An apple has a growth, a human has a growth period. It grows up into a point, then it ends, and then the entropy takes in. Everything fails. So like, it's not just death, right? Like at some point we quit growing, we start failing. Our bodies actually start failing, right? Entropy is that. It's the past point something is ripe, right? That's entropy, the downward slope. The denouement being like, so there's the upward slope, right? The climax, you hit the climax, you just go on the other side of the climax in the narrative. Everything on that other side of the narrative is the denouement up until the resolution, the end of the narrative. Everything has that entropy. Everything has that denouement. That's just true. And so I think modernism, and specifically World War I, which like inspired modernism, really like that was the concept. The way everything fails. So you can read something like The Wasteland, a famous poem, right? It literally is about the end of it all, the end of sort of human thought, the end of experience, the failures. Postmodernism did something different. We survived modernism. We survived World War I. We survived the failures of it all. And it was like, well, what comes next? I mean, like, what do we do next? There were no answers, right? And so like we became very like self-referential and turned that inward and like, well, what are we doing? What are the cultural norms that we actually engage with? So when you read something like Rushdie's The Little King, it's so referential. It mentions Facebook and Bitmoji. Don Quixote is a huge part. Don Quixote was written in like the late 1600s, early 1700s. So I mean, like he's referencing things that we all should know, just sort of in the general like canon. He references que sera, sera. Whatever shall be, shall be. Forgive my singing. But like, he's referencing 20th century song, right? So it becomes very referential in that way. Postmodernism is this sort of idea that like, it's hard to say. It's like a broad 20th century movement in architecture and criticism and art. But it's all about the idea that like you should be able to see the historical flow or understanding of time, and you should be able to look at it. It also embodies some sort of skepticism or like irony or like rejection of a singular narrative. And I think we see that as well when we look at that Rushdie story, because it specifically does not engage with a single narrative, right? It has two narratives going on, specifically like the Quixote like narrative, right? And then it also has the Dr. R.K. Smile, like his narrative. Like, so it's two narratives mashed together. What themes do you take away from that? That's the question. Postmodernism is so confusing because it doesn't, in fact, ask you to do anything in particular, so much as be a participant in the engagement with that text, right? The best, and because it's referential, the best like example of any postmodern text I can ever think of ever has always been Tarantino and his works. He uses something, and Rushdie does not use this, but Tarantino does, something called pastiche, which is just the idea that you take clips or ideas or like songs from other places and you build them into your own narrative or your own concept and you like represent them. Doesn't Tarantino do that? Like Tarantino has never like had an original thought so much as he's really good at taking like a dozen other people's thoughts and like putting them together in a fairly original way. And so if anyone ever asks you like what is postmodernism, just say Tarantino. You'll probably do fine. Probably do totally fine. But yeah, he's the perfect example of postmodernism. It's referential. It's not about anything in particular so much as it's about the idea that you understand the references and concepts that he's engaging with. And it's skeptical, right? It's ironic. It's not necessarily about you actually like really considering deeply the concepts they're in. When you watch a Tarantino movie, and man, this gets complicated because this makes me sound like I'm dismissing him. I think when you watch something like Django, it does ask you to interrogate the history of slavery in America. So postmodernism can, in fact, do that. It can ask you to take a serious position and really consider it. It really can. I think Salman Rushdie is asking you to seriously consider drug addiction in America and the pharmaceutical industry's culpability in America, and how, in fact, places like West Virginia and Arizona have been negatively impacted over the course of their histories, recently, by the way, in the last 10, 20 years, by the opioid addiction in America. But he also mentions like Bitmojis and GIFs, right? Like, I think he calls them GIFs. But yeah, GIFs. So, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it becomes this thing that, like, a text 20 years from now, 30 years from now, if they were to read the same text, they'd probably need footnotes to engage with it the same way that you and I do. I have to assume that, like, as many people read this narrative, and y'all are all brilliant people, one or two of y'all might not have picked up on the Quixote thing, even though Quixote is like one of the most important like Western texts of the last 400 years. Not anything about your education. If you haven't been exposed to it, you haven't been exposed to it. That's just the way it is, right? Like, I'm a literary scholar, so I don't ever assume anyone who knows any. I always assume that I don't know something you don't know, but I might because I've read a lot of books. So I don't know. Postmodernism is a hard concept to explain. Go to a modern art museum and look around. We can talk. The last thing I wanted to talk about was Tuesday. I specifically want to talk about that Vin Diesel film I sent out. I'm going to send it out again. What a weird movie, Multifacial. It was done like in the mid-90s. Vin Diesel could not find work. I'm not a huge Vin Diesel fan. He's fine. I actually really liked Pitch Black. Great science fiction movie. Smart. Not a bad actor, really, but like he has a definitive sort of role that he plays in most movies. I have no problem with that. He's a decent enough human being. I mean, I like The Rock more, but like, yeah, Vin Diesel seems fine. He seems to have taken on that Fast and Furious sort of like gig, right? Like where he's like, I'm a big macho dude. That movie was when he couldn't find work. Like there were a number of situations where he went out, applied for a role, and they were like, "You're too black for this role. You're too Italian looking for this role." He, in fact, I think he's half black or half. He's not. He has no like Latino history. I don't think. I think it's really half black. I'm not positive. I'll look it up because I sound racist right now. No, but I know that he's half black and half white, basically. And so he'd go out to these roles and he'd apply, and he wouldn't get them. He wouldn't get them, one, because he was too black for some roles and too white for others. And so he made his own movie that was sort of commentary on, additions in New York in like the mid to early 90s. As we go forward, talking about Africa, then talking about the Caribbean and South America, and then eventually moving into the United States, race is going to become more and more obvious. If you think about those locales of race, in Asia, we deal with it. We dealt with a little bit in the Vietnam War, specifically with O'Brien's narrative. We're going to deal with it pretty concretely when we deal with Achebe. But as we move into specifically the Caribbean, then South America, Central America, and America, race is going to be at the forefront of all of those conversations. It just is. Manifest destiny, you know? So I think it's interesting to look at a text like Multifacial, which was done, 20 some odd years ago, and at the beginning of somebody like Vin Diesel's career, who's had a fairly successful career. I mean, he's been a pretty big name actor in Hollywood for a while. Certainly, he's been in millions and billions, franchises that made millions and billions. It's interesting to see his struggle and sort of the narrative that he came out of it. I'd like to trigger warn the situation and say that he specifically uses some very misogynistic language at the beginning of that movie. It's not a big deal because it's a monologue. He's like playing a racist character. I'm not saying it's not a big deal because misogynist language isn't the worst. It totally is the worst. But I think a text can be racist, and we don't assume that the author is racist. A text can be misogynist. We don't assume the author is misogynist. They might be trying to put something out there and like present it in a way that they're calling something out. I think he is. I think he's being smart in that moment. It's surprisingly smart for a Vin Diesel movie. I don't want to be dismissive of him as an actor. I really don't. I think it'll surprise some of you. This is not required, by the way. I'm only asking that if you want to call in on a Tuesday and we can have a conversation on Zoom, we're going to do that. And then Thursday we'll talk about specifically the Indian stories, Rushdie and Nadia Raman. Narayanan. Narayan. Excuse me. Ah. So I'm curious about that. I'm curious to see what y'all think about multifacial. I thought I might start adding like short films on Tuesday. Maybe at some point I'll start offering extra credit. I don't know. We'll see what sort of turnout I get. But yeah, I'm happy to have a conversation about that. I think it'll be exciting. I think it'll be exciting to talk about Achebe. So if you have any questions, email me. Let's have a good week. I've been looking at stuff. I've really been impressed with the discussion boards. Quiz grades have been fine. I've changed those that I thought, like needed to be changed because of the questions, impartiality or was unfair or whatever. So we'll talk Tuesday. Those that want to talk, I don't require that y'all show up on Thursday, but it would probably be best if y'all did. We can talk about, any questions that you have. Think about like how you are going about the paper, what kind of research materials. I know that I intend tomorrow to, in fact, make like a research video, 15 or 20 minute, like this is the best like practices to do research. So we'll talk about it. I hope you all have a good week. Good luck with everything.